Welcome to Caregiver Chats. Today I'm talking about FTD, specifically Primary Progressive Aphasia. So stay tuned and we'll get into it. Hi, Dr. Lakelyn here. I'm a gerontologist and caregiving advocate for Home Instead, an honor company. I'm so glad you're taking the time to listen. Be sure to subscribe to Caregiver Chats on Apple, Spotify, or your favorite podcasting app. I also love your questions. You can email me at caregiverchats@homeinsteadinc.com. If you follow pop culture, you've likely heard about Bruce Willis being diagnosed with FTD. His wife and family have been open about their journey and the challenges they've faced finding support as they navigate his diagnosis and its progression. FTD, or Frontotemporal Dementia, is a lesser-known type of dementia. Since Alzheimer's is the most common, it tends to dominate the conversation. However, there are several other types of dementia, including FTD, which itself has various forms. As I've learned more about FTD, I've realized there is a lot to unpack, which is why I'm doing a two-part series to raise awareness and offer caregiving tips for those impacted by it. In this episode and the next, I'll be interviewing two individuals who have cared for loved ones with FTD. Each story is unique, with different care partner dynamics and FTD diagnosis. Today, I'll be speaking with Jerry, whose wife had primary progressive aphasia. Next time, I'll sit down with Melissa, who provided long-distance care for her father, who lived with behavioral variant FTD. Before we dive into my interview with Jerry, I wanted to share a bit more about primary progressive aphasia, or it's often referred to as PPA. PPA is a rare neurological condition characterized by a gradual decline in language abilities. It's a subtype of FTD, and it primarily affects parts of the brain that are responsible for speech and language. Unlike other forms of dementia where memory loss is often the first symptom, PPA begins with difficulties in communication, such as trouble finding the right words, forming sentences, or understanding language. PPA progresses slowly, and as it advances, other cognitive functions can become affected. While there's currently no cure for PPA, treatment focuses on speech therapy and communication strategies to help maintain language for as long as possible. Additionally, support from caregivers and family is crucial, as individuals with PPA eventually require assistance with daily communication and other activities. I was fortunate to get to talk with one of those caregivers who have lived this journey. Joining me today is Jerry Horn. His wife, Debbie, was first diagnosed in 2014 at the age of 62 with PPA. Jerry provided loving care and support to Debbie until she passed in 2019. In the midst of his caregiving, he became a volunteer for the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration, or AFTD, in 2017 and continues today as an AFTD ambassador. I can't wait for you to hear my conversation with Jerry. Hi, Jerry. Thank you so much for joining me today.
Well, thank you, Lakelyn. I appreciate you asking me to be on your podcast and giving me an opportunity to talk a little bit about the AFTD and FTD in general.
Well, the pleasure is all mine, and I'm really looking forward to our conversation and sharing more about FTD. And I know that as I was talking about, there are various types of FTD, and your wife, Debbie, specifically had the PPA, primary progressive aphasia type of FTD. So can you just tell us a little bit more about that specific type of FTD?
Yes. In the FTD spectrum, there are basically two main types of FTD. There's the behavioral variant FTD, which is primarily a behavioral disorder. A subvariant of FTD is PPA, which is primary progressive aphasia. And primary progressive aphasia is also broken down into three subvariants of that. There's semantic variant, there is the agrammatic, and the logopenic. And all three of them have many similarities, but they're more specific to how the vocabulary is parsed by the individual. My wife in particular had what they term the semantic variant, which meant that she lost her ability to put vocabulary in the correct order and to use the correct syntax. Oftentimes, early in her progression, she would substitute words. Uh, she would sometimes use personal pronouns instead of actual names, or she would substitute names themselves, such as she would call one of our daughters, but she'd call her by our cat's name.
I see.
So with PPA, what happens is it affects the left temporal lobe of the brain, which is the area in the frontal cortex that controls language construction. The person does not lose the vocabulary. Those words are stored in a different part of the brain where the long-term memories are, and they have those vocabulary words. They're just not able to put them together in an understandable order. So you end up with what they call word salad, where you'll have words that are randomly spaced together, or that, and towards the end of the disease, as it progresses, the vocabulary continues to decline to a point where it becomes very unintelligible. And the only way that you can really communicate with someone with PPA is through verbal cues and, just understanding who that person is and what they're trying to say non-verbally.
Thank you so much, Jerry, for sharing more insights. It is so interesting. The more I'm learning about FTDs, there are those different kind of types and then the subtypes. So thank you for explaining that. And you also had shared some of the symptoms that Debbie was presenting. Are there any other common symptoms of PPA that are common in addition to the ones that you just mentioned?
Well, everyone who has a form of FTD really presents symptoms in a different way. We like to say, with the AFTD, we like to say that, if you've seen one person with FTD, you've seen one person with FTD.
Yeah.
So you really can't put it into a concise box and say everyone will have certain symptoms at certain times. With the PPA, a lot of times as it progresses, and the same thing with the BVFTD, is that the symptoms will tend to merge as the disease progresses.
I see.
Basically, what happens is whatever part of the frontal cortex is affected first in the disease is the area where the greatest loss is. So if it's in the left temporal lobe, it's going to be language. If it's in the frontal cortex, it's going to be more related to behavioral issues, or how you perceive just common situations. With my wife, we first started noticing that she was having just brief periods of short-term memory loss. And an individual who has any form of FTD generally does not lose their long-term memory. They retain that long-term memory, which is different from Alzheimer's. But the person, in my wife's case, she would have these little short-term memory lapses, and we just chalked it up to, she's getting older and she was under stress with her job. Ironically, she herself was a speech pathologist and worked with children in public schools. And it became a concern when we would have these little incidents like she went up to visit our daughter at college, and it was a trip we had made together on numerous occasions. Well, on this particular trip, I wasn't able to go with her. And as she's leaving the college campus, she took a wrong turn and ended up like 12 miles north of where she should have turned off. And she was completely lost, confused, called me, and I
Mm.
had to walk her back through the steps to get her back to the right road. So we had little incidents like that. But then she also would start having some of this word salad going on where she
Mm.
would mix up words and that. And the first time that we were in a doctor's office with a neurologist, he really didn't find enough connected symptoms to be able to come up with a diagnosis at that point.
Mm.
So, it took it took several doctors, actually five neurologists in total,
Wow.
before we came up with a diagnosis. And it was a period of time that started, well, it really began in 2011 with she was still working, and her school principal at that time, she had been assigned to the largest school in our county, and she was given a very heavy caseload as a speech pathologist. Speech pathologists are considered itinerant, meaning that every year they're assigned to a school based on the needs of that particular district.
Hmm.
So she would move from school to school, but she was assigned to the largest school in the county, and they assigned her a caseload of 55 students, and that was 55
Mm.
special ed students, which was really putting her under a lot of pressure. But they kept sending people out from the county office to try to talk her into taking early retirement, which she was not even, thinking in terms of early
Mm.
retirement at that point. Because back in 2011, she was only 60 years old at that point.
Wow.
And so she did finally acquiesce when they gave her kind of a, if you don't retire now, you're not going to be grandfathered in because the legislature changed the terms of retirement. And
Mm.
so she did take early retirement in 2012 and worked as a substitute teacher. But the concern of the principal was, and I don't know exactly what the principal was seeing because at home we weren't seeing it so much, but her principal was afraid that she would forget to go to a classroom and pick up a student for a therapy session, or that she would forget to return a
Mm.
student to a therapy session. So, there were concerns from the outside that third parties were seeing that, maybe those who are close to her, like myself, were not seeing. And
Mm.
it was just, a cumulative of one little thing and then another little thing. And just as an aside, when Bruce Willis was first diagnosed,
Yeah.
they said that he had aphasia, and they did not define it at that time. And aphasia can be caused by many different things. Primary progressive aphasia within FTD is only one form of aphasia. My
Hmm.
wife, being a speech pathologist, actually had dog-eared one of her old college textbooks on the pages and the chapters that were written about aphasia. And aphasia can be caused by stroke. It can be, a temporary situation. It can be caused by other things,
Hmm.
other than FTD. But she she ended up, with the diagnosis, and we just had to deal with symptoms as they came up. So.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing a little bit about your diagnosis journey. That was going to be a question that I asked you. And, having your wife go through this at age, 60, that's fairly young. And the age of onset of FTD tends to be younger for individuals as compared to other types of dementia. Is that true?
Yes, that's very true. The the range of age can range all the way from people in their 20s all the way up to
Wow.
80, but the average age of onset is generally someone who is in their mid 50s to early 60s. Um, it is a very devastating disease from
Mhm.
a financial aspect because oftentimes it hits families when they are still in their peak earning years
Yes. Hmm.
and they may still have children at home. Now, in my case, both of our daughters were already grown and had left the house. We were empty nesters at that point. But when my wife was diagnosed, she was 62 years old.
Hmm.
So she was kind of right in the average range. And the average from the time of diagnosis until a person's death is generally 7 to 8 years with FTD. A lot of it, in my experience, a lot of it is dependent on at what point in the progression the diagnosis is made.
Oh, yes.
And it can take it's an average of like 3.8 years to get a diagnosis.
Wow.
The reason it's so hard to get a diagnosis is that we do not have specific biomarkers at this point in time. We're getting
Hmm.
closer in the research. They've identified some genes, and on the hereditary side, they're making good strides and progress with the clinical research. But for the sporadic part of the disease, which is what we think my wife had, she had no hereditary indications that any of it was genetic. She was not genetically tested, but
Mm.
she had two aunts that had Alzheimer's, but she had no family history of FTD or any FTD related,
Wow.
instances. But the diagnosis is generally a lengthy period of time, being that the symptoms can come at random points and they can be spaced apart. And for a doctor to try to assemble that together, and unless the doctor is very aware of FTD, and that's what we're working on very hard, is to build up the awareness, because most doctors are trained to look for dementia in older people, and
Yeah.
they don't think of somebody coming in who's in their 50s as having dementia. So
Hmm.
they may do a lot of other testing, and oftentimes someone who has a form of FTD ends up being misdiagnosed with depression,
Wow.
because a lot of the depression symptoms are very similar to what occurs with FTD. But of course, depression can be treated, and you get take away the depression, and the person's, dementia kind of disappears. But that does not happen with FTD. FTD is, we don't have a cure for it, um, and it is ultimately fatal
Mm.
because it's a progressive disease, and of course, that's in the name with PPA.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Jerry, for giving us further insights into kind of that diagnosis process. And I think, the awareness piece is so important. I know that's why you do advocacy work through the AFTD, the Association for Frontotemporal Degeneration. And you mentioned Bruce Willis, too. I think that since he has come forth with his diagnosis, a lot more attention is being paid to this disease, and people are learning and becoming educated, which I think is so important. And that way, hopefully, we can identify earlier in individuals, so people don't have to go that. I think you said 3.8 years to get that diagnosis. That's a long time. A lot can change and happen, and um, to your point also of kind of the financial side of things, kind of working through that diagnosis process. If you have to stop working or put things on hold, that can really can impact things significantly. So it's it is, I think, so important to learn how FTD is different from Alzheimer's and other types of dementias, so that we can best support family members, care partners, caregivers that are impacted, and individuals that are impacted by FTD.
Yes, that's exactly right. The earlier the diagnosis, the better. Not from a standpoint that you can prevent the disease from progressing, although there are some clinical studies that are being done that will help, you know, delay the progression. They can't stop it, but they can delay it with certain procedures that they're
Mhm.
looking at. And hopefully with all of this research that, ultimately one day we'll have the key that it will unlock what is the cause of the disease in the first place, and is there something we can do to prevent it?
Yes.
As far as doctors, we need the awareness factor there, so that this stigma of dementia being only an old person's disease
Mhm.
is lifted. We use a statistic that we feel is very understated, in saying that there are 60,000 diagnosed cases of FTD in the United States. That actually goes back to a study that was done back in 2011, which we as ambassadors with the AFTD have long felt that that number is way understated.
Mm.
It's way much more than that 60,000. And a large part of that is because there are so many misdiagnosed or undiagnosed cases out there.
Yeah.
And a lot of that, again, comes back to just the awareness factor. And through what you're doing with your podcast and others, we're getting that word out more and more. And certainly it did help when Bruce Willis diagnosis was announced. Emma, his wife, was very gracious in allowing the FTD to be the kind of the spokesperson for her. She came to the organization herself as a caregiver, wanting assistance,
Mm.
and through her working back and forth with AFTD, uh, she made it very clear that she did not want the announcement going public unless it went through the AFTD to help control the misinformation that inevitably was going to happen. Um, and she was at our education conference this past May in Houston. She's been very supportive of the organization, and she's been one of our chief advocates in helping get the word out. Certainly we didn't wish to have another person diagnosed with FTD.
Mm.
And like with Bruce, he's got the PPA like my wife has. It's been interesting to me in my experience. I have facilitated a in-person support group for the last 7 years now, and for a period of time, for about 4 years, I had a group of 4 different men who were coming to my support group, and every one of them, their wives had primary progressive aphasia, which I found, really interesting, in the fact that PPA is a rarer form of FTD
Mm.
as a whole, and FTD is a rarer form of dementia as a whole.
Yeah.
Uh, the term dementia is oftentimes thrown out as a generic umbrella term. It is an umbrella term. Uh, I hear it often misused in terms of dementia and Alzheimer's are all one and the same, and they're not. It's part
Right.
of a spectrum. Alzheimer's is a big chunk of that spectrum, 60 to 65%. Is Alzheimer's, but then you've got FTD, and you've got the variants of FTD, and you've got CSP and PSP, and different other variants that are out there. The Lewy body dementia, and those often get ignored. FTD comes in second on the list, believe it or not, with
Wow.
behind Alzheimer's. So we kind of, fall into the shadow of Alzheimer's. I I I do hate to hear that a doctor will interchange those words, and I have people come to my support group and said, the doctor just said we got dementia, and I said,
Mm. It's
well,
so important
they're
to
not.
Yeah,
They
push
need to
for
be more
more
specific.
specific.
Uh,
Exactly. Well, and Jerry, I think that, well, one, thank you for hosting a support group for 7 years. That's incredible. I can only imagine the number of lives you've impacted and touched through those groups. I know many of the people that listen to our podcast are family caregivers or care partners. Do you have any, tips or experience or stories that you can share about caring for someone living with PPA that might be helpful or encouraging, or just um, anything meaningful that you have gleaned over the years? I'm sure we don't have enough time to hit it all because we could probably talk about that topic alone forever, but would love for you to share some thoughts.
Well, right. That topic is near and dear to me because I did care for my wife for 5 years. I kept her at home. My goal was to make our lives as normal as possible for as long as possible.
Mm.
I would take her out. We would go to restaurants until that became burdensome in that she lost her cognitive abilities to really understand things. And,
Mm.
we would be in a restaurant. I remember one time we sat down and we're waiting for our server to come, and she gets up and she starts clearing other people's tables that had
Mm.
left. And I said, Debbie, you don't have to do that. They do that for you here. um, and then another time she just took a whole couple packets of sugar and dumped them on top of her meatloaf, which
Mm.
but I think as being a caregiver, there are rewards as well as the challenges of being a
Mhm.
caregiver. And I think you have to know your own limits, number one. And if you get to where you feel like you're at that breaking point, you need to just take that break, back away from your person, your spouse, or whoever it is you're caring for, and just take a few moments to yourself. I mean, I used to go out in the garage and do a primal scream sometimes just because,
Mm.
like, I can't take this anymore. But you have to realize too that that person they may not be able to communicate with you as well as they used to, but they are still that same person in there,
Yes.
and they're struggling to get out what they want to tell you. They may not be able to tell you the way that you expect them to. It may come out in aberrant behavior, anger, or, some kind of crazy thing they might do. But that person is still there. And I like to relate this one story that I was feeling particularly stressed in this particular week with caregiving responsibilities. And there's a lot of unpleasant things you have to do as a caregiver. I mean, it just comes with the territory. Well,
Mm.
I was, just muttering under my breath and saying, I am so unappreciated. I can't do this anymore. And, my wife at that point maybe had 10% of her vocabulary that she could use
Mm.
understandably. Most of the time she spoke in this, what I would call Debbie language, which basically it was gibberish. I mean, she would look at me, say something. I had no idea what she was telling me. And I just, yes, honey, yeah, I agree. Yeah, I had no idea what I was agreeing to. But she would stare at me until I answered her. Well, this one particular week when I was so upset, I put her to bed that night. And she also had Parkinsonism. And during the night, her body would kind of freeze up. She would sleep in a fetal position, and then in the mornings, I would have to kind of massage her legs and work her to get her out of the bed because she was so stiff. If she tried to get out, she'd literally fall on the floor. So I had to assist her in getting up. So I had gotten her up, had her standing, was holding both of her hands, looking her eye to eye. She looks at me, and for 2 weeks, she had not been able to say one plain English sentence that made any sense. But she looked at me that morning and she said, I appreciate everything you do for me.
Wow.
And I felt like this big, I was like,
Mm.
oh my, here I'd been saying all these awful things and she heard and understood everything I said.
Wow.
So just be aware that the other person is still there, and they may not be able to express themselves in that same way that you're used to, but they still exist, and you need to just love them the same way you've always loved them. And I used to try these little mental exercises and try to get inside her head and think, well, how is she feeling? You know,
Mm,
she's feeling trapped in her own body. She can't express herself, and that's got to be terribly frustrating.
yeah.
I can't imagine. And she literally, one thing that she taught me in being a caregiver is you live one day, one moment at a time, because she had no ability to really think to the past or look to the future.
Mm,
She strictly lived in the moment. And really, in reality, that's all that we all have. God gives us time, He gives us our
mm,
lives, and He gives us one moment at a time. And we need to make the most of every moment that He gives us.
mm. Thank you for sharing that story. And it is so interesting just how this disease, day by day, some people might have a really good day or a more frustrating, challenging day, um, and you do have to be so adaptable and kind of check in with your own emotions. And I think that you made so many good points there about making sure you don't reach burnout, taking time for yourself, even if it's to just go out in the garage. And I like that primal scream, just kind of release that stress and find ways that work for you. Um, because for many family caregivers, care partners, it's a multi-year caregiving journey. It's a marathon, not a sprint, and you do have to make sure you're giving yourself what you need along that journey so you can continue on it.
Well, one of the first things I tell my group is always, is if you're a caregiver, you have got to prioritize your own needs. You've got to take care of yourself, because if you don't, who's going to take care of that person you're caring for? And the caregiver statistics are not good. I mean, 60
Mhm.
to 70% or more of caregivers either suffer from stress related illnesses or they predecease the person they're caring
Mhm.
for. And
Yeah.
that's broad spectrum. That's not just in the dementia world. That's anyone who's caring for somebody full
Right.
time. It's a very stressful job, and you have to put yourself first. It's like the analogy that's used with being on an airplane. They always tell you, put the oxygen mask on
Mhm.
yourself first so that you can help others around you. Because if, you pass out, then you're no good to anybody.
Right.
So, it's the same thing with a caregiver. You've got to, address your own needs, take care of yourself. If it means bringing in extra help, I was very fortunate in that with my wife. We had a very good adult daycare center that was designed for dementia clients, and I had her enrolled in that. Was able to take her during the days, and they would, had her in group activities, and she loved going.
Mm.
To her, it was like going to school. She was
Yeah.
used to being in a group setting, and it was good for her. As her disease progressed, I was able to bring in additional help, and one thing that I would highly recommend that anyone who's in a caregiving situation with someone who has FTD or other related dementias, don't be afraid of the word hospice.
Mm.
I was able to have my wife on hospice. She was on hospice for 26 months. Just because they put you on hospice does not mean that it is end of life and that you got 1 week left. That's pretty much the conception because of
Yeah.
cancer patients and other diseases that are more linear in their progression. But when it comes to dementia, if you qualify and you get on, the likelihood of them taking you off is very slim, because it's a progressive disease and you're not getting better. Now, if you start, showing signs that you're getting better, they're going to take you off, and they review it every 60 days. But I was assured continuously with my wife that was not ever going to happen, because I used to get to
Mm,
the point where, she's not really declining, she's not really getting any better, but they're just going to say it's maintenance, and they're going to take her off the assistance. Now, being that we were in her 60s, we were able to get her on Medicare, and Medicare
mm,
pays for hospice. Private insurance companies, a lot of them will pay for hospice as well. So you just have to look at your individual situation.
yeah.
One of the other helps for me was being able to bring in home caretaker services. I'm
Yeah.
trying to think of the word, but I had caretakers who would come in, and I did not have it broad based. I mean, I think I set up with a company. I had like 15 hours a week. They would come in. Mostly it was in the evenings, just to give me a break where I could go out, get some dinner. And I took on a project for myself, self-care of walking. So I did a lot of
Mm,
walking. But that gave me a break to where I could get away from the caregiving responsibilities and just have some time away and by myself. And it just helps to refresh and recharge your own batteries to be able to do that. So I know that's another expense added into the mix. But and a lot of times, in families, there are other family members that can step in and help for a while.
right.
That doesn't happen in all families. I know, unfortunately, that a lot of individuals who are caregivers are doing it solo.
Yeah.
But if you can get those layers of help added in as the disease progresses, it really will help you, and it helps the other person, person you're caring for as well, because they get a better quality of care. If you get burned out, you're not going to be a very good caregiver. So,
Gosh. Yes, I think, layering in that support is really important, and kind of discovering what support is available in your communities. I love that you mentioned adult day services and in-home care services, having some time away. We call that respite. And sometimes there are grants for respite care. So those are things that you want to start looking into as you kind of go through this journey before you get to that burnout point,
uh-huh.
hopefully. That way you can give yourself that break over time.
Right.
You know,
Well, you mentioned grants, and we have what we call the Comstock grant, which is named after the founder of the AFTD, Helen Ann Comstock. And that's a grant that you can apply for that will help with respite care. And we
fantastic.
also have grants too if your loved one has FTD, and you want to attend the education conference, which is held every year, usually in May at different cities. This coming May, it will be in Denver. We were
Okay.
in Houston last year. But there's also grant monies that are available to help you to be able to attend that conference.
That's
I never
fantastic.
was able to when I was caregiving, because by the time I was aware of it, Debbie was too far advanced in her progression. I really didn't have the care to be able to leave her with someone for 4 or 5 days. But early on, a lot of times it's easier to do that. But even if you can't make it to the education conference, we also webcast it, so you're able to
Fantastic.
sign up, and it does not cost you any money. AFTD does not charge you to attend the education conference online. So,
What
uh,
a fantastic resource. Well, and
yeah,
I know the AFTD has so many great resources. Their website is the aftd.org. And actually, we're just wrapping up FTD, pardon me, Awareness Week. Is that right, Jerry? A
right.
whole week where your organization is doing a lot of outreach, education, and even some fundraising around FTD to again raise awareness, because as we've been talking about, that's so important.
World FTD Awareness Week is it ran from September 22nd through September 29th. Like I say, it just now wrapped up. And the AFTD does a lot of activities based around that, a lot of awareness activities. And Our premier fundraising event is a grassroots event. We call it Food for Thought, and actually it's still going on through the first week of October, with many of our volunteers doing their Food for Thought events during this week. But it basically involves volunteers stepping up and saying they want to do something for the AFTD and help raise some funds and raise awareness, and they do it by tying in something food related. Some people do recipe swaps. Some people make soup and sell it. Others do restaurant give backs, where they set up an event in a restaurant and people come eat, and then part of their meal goes back to the AFTD. So, there's lots of different ways that people participate in the Food for Thought. So in your area, you might want to look up on the AFTD.org website and see what events are in your area for Food for Thought. And if any are still going on, go out and support it. Buy a piece of cake.
I'm always up for a reason to have a piece of cake. Sure. Well, fantastic. Jerry, thank you so much for joining me today and for sharing your personal caregiving journey and your wife Debbie's journey with PPA, form of FTD, and for all the advocacy you do and continue to do. It really is inspiring, and it's meaningful, and it's so needed and necessary. So thank you so much.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on and enjoyed the conversation.
Likewise. Take care. As we end today's episode, I want to thank Jerry for joining me. He mentioned his advocacy work with AFTD, and I wanted to share that I've included links in the show notes to AFTD.org, the association's website, which offers valuable information and resources, including their HelpLine, support groups, and more. Another important organization I wanted to highlight for spousal caregivers is the Well Spouse Association. Their website is also in the show notes. They provide support to spouses across all disease states and ages who are caring for a spouse or partner. I also interviewed a board member of Well Spouse in episode 5 of Caregiver Chats. It was an awesome episode, so you'll want to be sure to go back and listen. I hope the information we discussed today helps you as you navigate supporting someone living with FTD. Be sure to join us for part 2 of the series, where we'll focus on another form of FTD called behavioral variant FTD. If you have additional thoughts or stories to share on this topic, I invite you to email me at caregiverchats@homeinsteadinc.com. That's caregiverchats@homeinsteadinc.com. I also invite you to follow us on Facebook at Home Instead Inc. That's Home Instead INC for previews of upcoming episodes, caregiving tips, and more. You can find all the links in today's show notes. Thank you for listening, and please remember to take good care of yourself while you care for others. Caregiver Chats is brought to you by Home Instead. If you're looking for in-home care to support you on your caregiving journey, please visit homeinstead.com to learn more.